So in today's lesson, we are going to continue with comparing and ordering, but today we're going to look at negative rational numbers. And this word rational can be very intimidating because it's not a word that many of you may have heard before in math. But I want you to realize that when we're talking about rational numbers, we're talking really just about fractions and decimals. So we're going to look at negative fractions and negative decimals and mixed numbers and improper fractions and how we compare those when we're talking about negatives. So we're still taking what we were learning about negatives and positives, but now we are applying them to fractions and decimals. So there's really not a lot of notes that we're going to do today. We are going to do a couple examples. I'm going to model a couple examples, some comparing and some ordering, and then you guys are going to try some on your desks. So we're not going to write anything in our spiral for this video. If you would like to go back and look at the examples again to remember how to do it, this video is available on Canvas as well as your notes under your Pages tab called Comparing and Ordering Negative Rational Numbers. So we don't need our spirals out. We just need to be listening and paying attention. And I'm going to do a couple problems with you, and then you guys will try some on your desks. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to start out very basic. We're going to look at comparing. So let's look at two fractions, but we're going to look at two negative fractions. So we have negative 2/3, and we're going to compare it to negative 1/2. And so there's a couple different ways that we can do this. The first thing I would like to show you is using a number line, because that's what we did in our previous notes when we were looking at whole numbers, negatives, and positives. So let's go ahead and look at a number line. So if we have 0, and here we have -1, we could have in between 0 and -1 divided in half, and this would be -1/2. We could also have thirds, and this would be 1/3, and this would be 2/3. So this would be -1/3 and -2/3. So here would be -1/2, and here would be -2/3. So -1/2 is closer to 0. -2/3 is farther from 0. So that makes -2/3 smaller than -1/2. What makes this a little bit confusing is if these were positive numbers, if we were comparing 2/3 to 1/2, 2/3 would be greater than 1/2. But remember, when we are talking about negative numbers are opposite. So the farther away from 0 we get, the smaller the number is. So even though the fraction 2/3 looks bigger than 1/2, -2/3 is actually smaller than -1/2. So just remember, negatives are opposite. The other way we could do this is we could change these fractions very easily into decimals using division. So we know that this is a fraction, but it's also the same as 2 divided by 3. So you could use your calculators and type into your calculators 2 divided by 3 to get the decimal. And the decimal is -67/100 approximately. I do have to round that because it is a non-terminating decimal, and that just means it goes on and on and on and on and on. But we just need at least the hundredths place in order to compare it. And then we can change 1/2 by doing 1 divided by 2 in our calculators. And remember, if the fraction is negative, the decimal is also going to be negative. And so that becomes -5/10. And you might want to go ahead and put a 0 just so you have the same number of decimal places. It makes it a little bit easier to compare. So again, you can think about money. You could think about 50 cents and 67 cents. Now, 67 cents, if it's positive, is more. But think about it as owing. Would you rather owe somebody 67 cents or would you rather owe somebody 50 cents? 50 cents is less to owe, so it makes the number greater. So this fraction is equivalent to negative 50, and this fraction is equivalent to negative 67. So you could use the number line to compare these fractions, or you can change these fractions to decimals and compare the decimals. But what is most important to remember is this. Negative numbers are opposite. So even though 67 hundredths looks bigger, when it's negative 67 hundredths, it's actually smaller than positive 67 hundredths. They're opposite. The more you owe, the larger the decimal when it's negative, the smaller it actually is, because you're getting further and further away from zero. As you move this way in the negatives, your number gets smaller. As you move this way in the positives, your number gets larger. So that's one example for comparing rational numbers. Let's look at another example for comparing rational numbers. So your second example for comparing rational numbers is negative 2/5 compared to negative 4/10. And so for this one, again, we have two negatives, but one is a fraction and one is a decimal. So in order to compare these, I highly recommend you change one to be the same as the other, meaning change the fraction to be a decimal or change the decimal to be a fraction, so that you're looking at two fractions or two decimals to compare. I think most of my students prefer to work with decimals. So let's take this fraction and change it to a decimal so that we can compare two decimals. Remember, if the fraction's negative, the decimal's negative. So we don't have to worry about the negative until the end, and we want to make sure that we keep that negative in front of our decimal. So right now I'm just going to worry about 2/5, and I'm going to type into my calculator 2 divided by 5, which is equal to 4/10. And remember, if the fraction is negative, so is the decimal. So this is negative 4/10 compared to negative 4/10. And so once you've got them the same, these are very easy to compare. These are equal. If they give you one fraction and one decimal, do not compare them without taking the time to make them the same. Two decimals or two fractions. It is very hard to compare them when they are not in the same form. So let's look at one more example of comparing before we jump to ordering. Let's look at negative 2/10 compared to negative 25 hundredths. So these are two decimals that we are comparing. Remember, as I said in the first example, if your decimals do not have the same number of decimal places, I highly suggest that you add zeros so that they're easier to compare. Notice that this decimal has two decimal places, tenths and hundredths, but this decimal only has one decimal place, tenths. It will make it easier to compare them if you add a 0 after the 2 to make it 20 hundredths and 25 hundredths. Even though 25 hundredths looks bigger, and if they were positive, it would be bigger, remember, negatives are opposite. So there's different ways that we can look at this to compare it. we can look at it on a number line. 2/10 would be about here, or 20 hundredths. And then we know that if this was 3/10, 25 hundredths would be in between 2/10 and 3/10. So it's farther away from zero, which makes 20 hundredths or 2/10 larger. The other way to do it is to always think about money. Would you rather owe somebody 20 cents or 25 cents? Money and owing to me is the easiest way to really think about comparing and ordering negative numbers. You don't want to owe money. The less money you owe, the better it is. So if you owe 20 cents, that's a greater number than owing 25 cents because you owe less. The less you owe, the bigger the number. So 2/10 or 20 hundredths is larger than negative 25 hundredths. So now we are going to look at putting several numbers in order that include rational numbers, negatives, decimals, and fractions. And we are going to put these in order least to greatest. So I'm going to write L to G up here at the top just to remember that we are putting them in order least to greatest. So when I see several numbers, the first thing I always recommend you do is separate them into positive and negatives and just help eliminate the number of numbers that we're looking at. Because right now we're looking at 5 different numbers, and that's a lot and can be overwhelming. But if we break it into positive and negatives, it gets a lot easier. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to circle all of the positive numbers. So we've got 0, which isn't positive or negative, but it helps us divide the positive and negative numbers. And then we have 2 and 2/10, which is positive. So when I'm putting these in order, I know that 2 and 2/10 is the largest, and then 0. And so that eliminates already 2 of the 5 numbers that I'm looking at. Then I have 3 more numbers, and the first thing that I notice is they're all negative. The second thing that I notice is all of their whole numbers are different. And that's important because it means we don't even have to worry about the fraction or decimal because we can compare them simply by looking at the whole numbers. So if I have -1, -3, and -2, remembering that the larger the negative, the smaller the value actually is. So you can think about -1 as owing $1, -3 and 1/4 as owing -$3 and change, and then -2 as owing $2. So we know we'd rather owe less money. So next we would have -1, then -2, and then our smallest value would be -3 and 1/4 because it's the largest amount that we owe. So this one is, in my opinion, very simple because there are no fractions or decimals that have the same whole number. So this is only really tricky when you have 2 numbers that you're ordering that the whole number for the fraction or the decimal is the same. So this is a pretty easy example. Let's look at another example that's a little bit more challenging, a little bit more difficult. And the reason this problem is a little bit more difficult is hopefully you see here you have -1 and also another -1. And so what that means is you have 2 whole numbers that you're really going to have to look at the decimal or the fraction in order to compare them. Let's start with the simple part. The first thing that I notice when I look at these 4 numbers is that this number is positive and the other 3 are negative. So again, if we're putting these in order least to greatest, my largest number is going to be my whole number, and there's only one of those. So I'm going to put that over here. And then my smallest number, if you're looking at your negatives, you have -3 as a whole number, -1 as a whole number, and -1 as a whole number. So -3 is owing more. So that's going to be my smallest. So I've found already my largest and my smallest number. The only thing I have to do now is figure out between these 2 remaining numbers which one is smaller and which one is larger. So because the whole numbers are the same, it's really not going to affect us at all, and we just need to look at the decimal and the fraction. So we have 7/10 and we have 1/2. And remember, I told you before, if you have a decimal and a fraction, you need to make them in the same form in order to compare them easier. So you can change 1/2 to a decimal or 7/10 to a fraction. I'm going to change 1/2 to a decimal because I think that's the easiest for you guys to do. And I would do that by typing into my calculator 1 divided by 2, which equals 5/10. So I'm comparing 7/10 to 5/10. Even though 5/10 looks smaller, remember, this is negative. So think about it as owing 70 cents or owing 50 cents. The more you owe, the smaller it is. So this is actually -1 7/10, and this is -1.5. Also remember that if you change it to a decimal in order to compare it, your final answer must be put back in the same form that the problem gave you. So we changed -1.5 to 5/10 in order to compare it. But our final problem, our final answer, put it back as a fraction. I can't tell you how many times students get problems wrong because they forget this step and they put the decimal that they changed it to in their final answer instead of the original problem. Don't go through all of this work and then get your answer wrong because you make that mistake. All right, now let's do some guided practice problems. Go ahead and get your Expo markers and socks out of the boxes on your desk. And let's pause the video and try number 1. I want you guys to compare these two negative fractions using the signs greater than and less than. And I want you to copy the entire problem. I don't just want you to use the sign greater than and less than. If you change them to decimals to compare them, I want that work on your desk to go with it. Don't erase the work so that as I go over it up here, you can compare your method. If you plot it on a number line, I want you to leave that work on your desk with the answer. So let's pause the video and try this problem on our desk. All right, so hopefully everybody got a chance to try this problem on the desk. So I'm going to work it out a couple different ways. The first way I'll do is the number line. So if I have a number line and I have 0 and -1, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to separate between 0 and -1 into thirds. So this would be 1, 2, 3. Remember, when you're drawing thirds, you only draw 2 lines to get 3 sections. When you're drawing fourths, you draw 3 lines to get 4 sections. So this would be -1/3, and this would be -2/3, and then 1 whole would be -3/3. So right here, I would have -1/3. Now I'm going to divide between 0 and -1 into fourths, and I'm going to do that in a different color so that you can kind of try to ignore the thirds and picture that the fourths are there as well. So try and ignore the thirds and pretend like this is divided into fourths. Fourths are a little bit smaller, so this is 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and then the whole is 4/4. So this would be -1/4, -2/4, or a half, -3/4, and then my whole would be -4/4. So right here, we have -3/4. So just by looking at this number line, which fraction is further away from 0? Remember, when you're doing negatives, the farther to the left you go, the smaller the fraction. So if both of these fractions were positive, 3/4 would be larger. But because they're negatives, -1/3 is closer to 0. So -1/3 is greater than -3/4. So let me show you another way to do this. You could also do this by changing these fractions to decimals and comparing the decimals. And I'm going to assume that this is the way most of you are doing it, but I'm going to continue to show you the number line as well because it's another really good strategy to being able to visualize these numbers. So if I change -1/3 into a decimal, I would do 1 divided by 3, which is a repeating decimal. It goes on and on and on. So I'm just going to round it to the hundredths place. So I get negative 33 hundredths. And then I'm going to do 3 divided by 4, and I get negative 75 hundredths. So would you rather owe 33 cents or 75 cents? Again, 75 cents is more, but if you owe it, it's a smaller number, because the more you owe, the worse off you are. So you want to owe less money when you're in the negatives. Remember, negatives are opposite. So even though it appears that 75 is larger, 75 hundredths is larger, when we're talking about negatives, 75 hundredths is actually smaller. Okay, guys, let's try another problem. This one, we are doing the same thing. We are comparing it greater than, less than. I want you to show all of your work on your desk and copy the problem. Don't just use the greater than and less than sign. Notice that both of these problems are in a different form. One is a fraction and one is a decimal. So remember, when working this problem out, you have to change one of them to a decimal or a fraction in order to compare them. Then you can use the number line, or you can compare the decimals. Go ahead and pause the video and try this problem on your desk. All right, so hopefully everybody got a chance to try this problem on their desk. So let's go ahead and work it out together. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change negative 1/2 to a decimal, and I'm going to do that by typing 1 divided by 2 into my calculator, and it gives me 5/10, which is negative 5/10. And we're comparing negative 5/10 to negative 3/10. You can think about that on a number line. You have 0 and negative 1. 5/10 is half, so it's right here. And 3/10 is a little bit to the right. So this is negative 3/10 and this is negative 5/10. And so the further away from 0 you get, the smaller you get. And so negative 5/10 is further away from 0 than negative 3/10. So negative 3/10 is greater than negative 5/10. Or if you read it left to right, negative 5/10 is less than negative 3/10. Hopefully everybody got that one right. Now we are going to try an ordering problem on our desk. So they're going to get a little bit harder. Again, any work that you do, changing fractions or decimals or anything like that, let's make sure we show that work on our desk. So we are going to put this problem in order, least to greatest. So let's pause the video now and try this problem on our desk. So even though this is an ordering problem, it's pretty easy because there are no numbers in this set that have the same whole number. So as always, when I have several numbers, the first thing I like to do is separate them into positive and negative. So here we have positive, decimal, and we have 0, which isn't positive or negative, but it's a good dividing line between our positive and negative. So 21 hundredths is positive, so I know that that's going to be my largest. And then 0 divides my negative and positive, so I know that's going to be next. So I've already eliminated 2 of those problems right off the bat. And then I have 2 more, and they're both negatives, but they have a different whole number. So this problem should have been very simple because we really don't even have to bother much with the fractions or decimals in order to come up with the answer. So you can look at just these whole numbers and compare just the whole numbers to figure out which one is smaller and which one's larger. Would you rather owe $7 or would you rather owe $2? $7 is more to owe, so that makes 7 3/4 the smallest, and then negative 2 7/10. So in order, least to greatest, the smallest is negative 7 3/4, then negative 2 7/10, 0, and then 21 hundredths. That was a pretty easy problem. Let's try one more ordering problem on our desk, and this one's going to be a little bit more challenging. So here you have 4 problems. Again, any work, 4 numbers in this problem. Again, any work that you do while solving this, please make sure you leave that work on your desk so that as we go over it together, you can look at your work and see maybe where you got stuck or what you did wrong. Let's pause the video now and try this problem on our desk. So as always, I recommend that when you are ordering problems, You start by getting your positives and separating your positives and your negatives and putting those in order first. For this problem, we only have one positive, so I know that 2 and 25/100ths is my largest. Then I'm going to look at my negative numbers, and I notice that 2 of those have the same whole number, and 1 has a different whole number. So I have -3 and -4. I know that -3 is larger than -4 because it's less money owed. So the closer you are to 0, the bigger the number. -3 would go after 2 and 25/100ths or before if you're going left to right, because it is going to be larger than my other two -4s. I don't know what order those other two go in because they both have the same whole number. So now I'm going to ignore the whole number and just compare those two fractions to see which one is larger or smaller. So you can change these to a decimal, which I'm sure some of you did. You could look at a number line, which some of you may have done. I'm going to show you another strategy. I'm going to change both of these to have the same denominator. So I'm going to use equivalent fractions, and I'm going to change this to 6/10. And so now it's really easy to compare 1/10 and 6/10 as fractions because the denominators are the same. So 6/10 is a larger fraction. But because we are talking about negatives, the larger fraction is farther from 0, which actually makes it the smaller mixed number. So it's -4 and 3/5, which is our smallest, and -4 and 1/10 next. Now, remember, when you change it to a decimal or an equivalent fraction or whatever strategy you're using, you cannot put 6/10 for your answer. You have to remember to go back and put it back in its original form for your final answer. Now, if you changed 1/10 to a decimal and 3/5 to a decimal, you may have gotten 1/10 and 6/10, and I would have added a 0 to get 10 cents and 60 cents and make that easier to compare. Even though 60 cents is more, remember these are negative. So you owe 60 cents. The more you owe, the smaller the number. So again, -4 and 3/5 is the smallest, then -4 and 1/10, then -3, then 2 and 25/100ths. So hopefully we're all starting to get the hang of this. We will continue to practice and review this tomorrow. You guys are doing a great job. Keep up all of your good work and behaving well for your substitute.